When we talk about what she thinks when you don't chase, we're really looking at a psychological shift that happens inside a woman's mind when a man who used to pursue her suddenly stops chasing her attention, validation, or presence. It's not just about silence or distance. It's about what that silence communicates to her emotionally and mentally. Now, speaking from my work with people over the years, I've seen this situation play out more times than I can count. And what surprises most men is that the absence of chasing doesn't create just one reaction. It creates layers of thoughts, often conflicting ones, depending on how she initially viewed the man. Let me welcome you properly, because if you're here, you're probably trying to understand something that feels confusing or even frustrating in relationships. And I want to break it down in a way that actually makes sense, not the typical surface level advice you hear everywhere. Here's where it gets interesting and honestly a bit uncomfortable for some people to hear. When a man stops chasing, her mind doesn't immediately jump to one conclusion. Instead, it starts evaluating. First, she notices the shift. Then, she begins to question the meaning behind it. Was he never serious? Did he lose interest? Or is he simply someone who values himself enough to step back? In many of the conversations I've had in this space, I've seen women go through a quiet mental recalibration. Not always emotional panic, sometimes curiosity, sometimes ego resistance, and other times genuine reflection about what kind of man she was dealing with in the first place. And this is where things become layered, because what she thinks isn't always what she shows. Outwardly, she might appear indifferent. Internally, there can be curiosity building, sometimes even respect forming, depending on the foundation you set before you stop chasing. So in this breakdown, we're going to explore exactly what goes on in her mind step by step when the pursuit disappears, and why silence can sometimes communicate more than constant effort ever could. This is where understanding psychology in relationships becomes powerful. Not to manipulate, but to understand what actually drives attraction, perception, and emotional value. One, the moment she notices the shift in your attention. In my work with people navigating relationships, I've learned something very consistent. The first thing that changes when a man stops chasing is not the relationship itself, but her awareness. It's subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but psychologically it is very real. I remember one pattern I've seen repeatedly in conversations over the years. A man who used to be consistent, checking in, initiating conversations, showing visible effort, suddenly becomes quieter. Not rude, not absent, just different. And from a clinical perspective, that difference is where her mind starts to wake up. At first, she doesn't always interpret it deeply. Most people don't. The human mind tends to normalize consistency. When attention is frequent, it becomes part of the background noise of emotional life. So when that attention reduces, her first reaction is often not emotional panic, but recognition. She notices the gap before she understands it. It might be something small in her daily routine. A message that usually comes in at a certain time doesn't arrive. A familiar tone of communication feels less present, or the energy in conversations feels shorter, more intentional, less available. And in that moment, her mind quietly registers. Something has changed. What I find interesting is that this stage is rarely about emotion. It's about detection. It's the mind scanning for patterns that no longer match what it was used to. And in many cases, she will not immediately confront it or even admit it to herself. Instead, she observes. From experience, I've seen that this observation stage can feel very neutral on the surface. She may continue her day normally, respond casually, or even appear unaffected. But internally, a subtle evaluation has begun. The brain is now comparing before and after without her consciously trying to do it. And here's where it becomes psychologically complex. Because when someone is used to being pursued, consistent attention can start to feel like a baseline reality. So when that baseline shifts, it creates a quiet disruption. Not necessarily emotional pain, just awareness that something familiar is no longer happening in the same way. In therapy conversations, I often hear reflections like, I don't know why, but it just felt different. Or I noticed he wasn't the same anymore. That noticing is the first psychological doorway. It's not yet interpretation, it's simply awareness. And awareness always comes before meaning. So in this very first stage, nothing dramatic is happening externally. No confrontation, no clear emotional reaction. But internally, something has already started. Her attention has turned toward the change itself. And once attention is locked on to change, the mind naturally begins to ask questions. That is where the next layer begins to form. 2, the confusion that replaces constant expectation. When we move into the second stage, something very important happens psychologically. After she notices the shift in your attention, the mind doesn't stay still. It tries to explain what it is seeing, and this is where confusion begins to replace expectation. In many relationship patterns I've observed over the years, a woman becomes used to a certain rhythm of attention. It doesn't have to be excessive or overwhelming. It can simply be consistent. A message here, a call there, a predictable presence that her mind starts to rely on more than she realizes. Humans are wired to build emotional patterns around consistency. So when that pattern suddenly changes, the mind doesn't immediately accept it as nothing. It tries to solve it. At this stage, what used to be automatic expectation, he will text, he will check in, he will respond in a certain way, starts to break down. And when expectation breaks, confusion fills the gap. From a psychological standpoint, confusion is not a strong emotional reaction yet. It's more like mental friction. She is no longer fully certain about what your behavior means, but she also doesn't have enough information to draw conclusion. That uncertainty is what creates internal tension. I've seen this expressed in very subtle ways. A delayed response might suddenly feel more significant than it used to. A shorter message might be overanalyzed. Even silence that was once comfortable now feels slightly off, though she may not admit it openly. What's important for men to understand here is that confusion is not always visible. On the outside, she may appear completely normal. She might still go about her routine, still laugh, still engage with her world, but internally her mind is trying to fill in blanks that your reduced pursuit has created. And here is where many men misunderstand the situation. They assume nothing is happening because nothing is being shown. But psychologically, the absence of clarity is already an active process in her thinking. In therapy-style discussions, I often explain it like this. The brain dislikes unfinished patterns. When something was once predictable and suddenly becomes unpredictable, the mind starts running silent simulations. Did I do something wrong? Is he busy? Is he losing interest, or is something changing about how he sees me? Notice that these are not emotional conclusions yet. They are questions, and questions create mental activity. Another important layer here is control. Even if she is not consciously aware of it, predictability gives a sense of emotional control. When your behavior becomes less predictable, that sense of control weakens slightly. And when control weakens, confusion naturally increases. But confusion does something else. It creates attention. The mind begins to monitor more closely. Not because she has decided to chase, but because uncertainty makes people observe more than usual. For men, this is where patience matters, because this stage is not about immediate reactions. It is about internal recalibration. She is trying to make sense of a new emotional environment where your presence is no longer guaranteed in the same way. And until the mind finds meaning, confusion remains the dominant experience. This is the point where perception begins to shift, even if it hasn't yet turned into action. 3, the quiet ego check she goes through internally after confusion settles in. Something more subtle begins to happen, and this is where things become psychologically deeper. In the third stage, it's no longer just about noticing or questioning your change in behavior. Now her mind begins a quiet internal evaluation of herself. In the therapeutic conversations I've had around relationship dynamics, this is one of the most overlooked stages because it doesn't look emotional on the surface. There are no dramatic reactions, no obvious signs. But internally, there is a very quiet ego check happening. What I mean by that? When a man who used to pursue starts pulling back, the mind doesn't only wonder about him. It also begins to reflect inward, not always in a fully conscious way, but through small thoughts that appear and disappear quickly. Thoughts like, was I the reason he changed? Or did I misread how interested he was? Or even, am I still as valued as I thought I was in his attention? This is not about insecurity in a negative sense. It's about self-perception being temporarily challenged. Human beings naturally build a sense of emotional positioning in relationships. When someone consistently shows interest, it reinforces a feeling of being chosen, valued, and prioritized. Over time, that reinforcement becomes part of how a person sees themselves in that dynamic. So, when that reinforcement reduces, the mind doesn't just look outward for answers, it also looks inward. And this is where the ego quietly steps in. The ego in this context is not arrogance. It's the part of the mind that maintains self-image. It asks questions like, what does this change say about me? Even if the person never says it out loud, I've seen this reflected in very subtle behaviors. A woman might not directly react to your distance, but she may become slightly more observant of her own actions. She might revisit conversations in her mind, trying to see if she said something differently, or she may become more aware of how she is being perceived, even in unrelated social situations. This is not always emotional distress. Often it is internal recalibration. And here is what men often misunderstand at this stage. They think nothing is happening because there is no visible pursuit from her side. But psychologically, this is one of the most active internal stages. Because once attention is no longer freely given, the mind starts assigning value differently. And when value feels uncertain, self-reflection naturally increases. In my experience, this stage is also where pride and curiosity begin to interact. Part of her mind may want to dismiss the change as unimportant. Another part may start questioning why it feels important at all. That internal contradiction creates a silent mental loop. She may not act on it. She may not express it, but she feels it in small moments. When she notices herself checking for your presence, when she realizes she is slightly more aware of your absence than she expected, or when she catches herself wondering what shifted in the dynamic. That is the ego check. And it is quiet but powerful because once a person begins to evaluate their own place in someone else's attention, the emotional dynamic is no longer one-sided. It has already started to shift internally, even if nothing has been said out loud. For the question of whether she lost control or interest at this stage, something very real starts happening inside her mind. And I want you to understand this clearly from a relationship psychology perspective. After the noticing, the confusion, and the quiet ego reflection, her thoughts naturally move toward one central question. What exactly changed between us? Now, let me bring in a simple example I've seen play out in real relationships. Imagine a woman in a long-term relationship with a man who used to be very present. He would initiate conversations, plan meetups, and stay emotionally engaged. Over time, he begins to pull back. Not in a dramatic way, just less chasing, less emotional intensity, more space. Nothing openly hostile, just distance and energy. At first she notices, then she becomes confused. Then she starts reflecting inward. But now something new appears. She starts questioning control versus interest. In her mind, there are two possible interpretations forming side by side. One part of her thinks maybe he's simply losing interest in me. The other part thinks, or maybe I no longer have the same influence I used to have in this dynamic. And this is where the psychology becomes very layered, because losing interest and losing control are not the same thing. But emotionally, they can feel similar in the beginning stages of uncertainty. In the relationship example I mentioned, I once observed a situation where a woman began to subtly test the dynamic, not in an obvious or confrontational way, but through small behavioral shifts, delayed replies, slightly different tone, watching to see if the man would return to his previous level of pursuit. What was really happening wasn't just about attraction, it was about stability and emotional influence. She was trying to determine whether his distance meant emotional withdrawal or whether he was simply no longer responding in the same predictable way. And this is what many men don't realize. When you stop chasing, you don't just reduce attention, you also disrupt familiarity. And when familiarity is disrupted, the mind tries to regain orientation. So she begins asking internal questions like, is he actually pulling away, or is he just not reacting the same way anymore? Or if I don't engage first, will he still come toward me the way he used to? Notice what's happening here. This is no longer just confusion. This is evaluation of emotional power within the dynamic, but she won't express it directly. Instead, she observes. She monitors patterns. She looks for consistency or inconsistency in your behavior because at this point, her mind is trying to determine whether this shift is emotional rejection or behavioral change. In many cases, I've seen this stage create subtle tension, not conflict, but awareness. She becomes more conscious of timing, responses, and your overall availability. And here's the important part for men to understand. This is where perception starts to solidify. Because whichever conclusion her mind leans toward, loss of interest or loss of control will influence how she emotionally positions herself next. If she believes it's loss of interest, she may begin detaching emotionally. If she believes it's loss of control, she may start testing re-engagement in subtle ways. Either way, the relationship dynamic is no longer passive. Something has shifted internally, and she is now actively trying to understand where she stands in relation to you. 5, the curiosity that begins to replace certainty. At this point in the process, something very important starts to happen inside her psychology, and it's often misunderstood by men who are watching from the outside. After noticing the change, feeling the confusion, reflecting internally, and questioning the balance of control versus interest, she begins to enter a new mental state: curiosity. Let me ground this in a real relationship scenario I've seen unfold many times. Picture a woman in a relationship where the man has started to withdraw his usual level of attention. He is still present, still respectful, but no longer predictable in the way he used to be. He doesn't chase conversations the same way. He doesn't respond with the same emotional urgency, and he doesn't overinvest his time like before. So, Inky Daddy, initially she tried to understand it. Then she questioned herself. Then she tried to understand the power shift. But now something changes. She stops trying to solve it immediately and starts wanting to understand it instead. This is where curiosity replaces certainty. Certainty is what she had before. She knew how he would behave. She knew the rhythm of his attention. She could predict his emotional availability. That predictability created a mental comfort even if she wasn't consciously aware of it. But now that certainty is gone, and in its place is curiosity. In the relationship example I mentioned, I've seen women start to observe their partner more carefully, not out of panic, but out of interest. They begin to notice small changes in behavior and wonder about their meaning instead of immediately assigning emotional conclusions. She might think, why is he not reacting the same way anymore? Or what changed in him that made him less available in the way I'm used to? But the tone of these thoughts is no longer confusion or insecurity. It is curiosity trying to map a new version of reality. This is a key psychological transition because curiosity is different from emotional reaction. When a person becomes curious, they are no longer resisting the change as much. They are studying it. And in relationships, the moment someone starts studying your behavior instead of assuming it, the dynamic shifts significantly. She may start paying closer attention to your tone, your timing, your presence in conversations. Not because she is trying to regain control immediately, but because her mind is trying to build a new understanding of who you are in this new version of the dynamic. In many cases, I've observed this stage creates a subtle shift in engagement. She may initiate conversations differently, not with urgency, but with observation. She may test the consistency of your distance, not to challenge it, but to understand its structure. And here is what men need to understand clearly. Curiosity is powerful because it keeps attention alive without emotional pressure. She is no longer reacting emotionally in a linear way. Instead, she is mentally mapping you. And when a woman begins to map a man, psychologically, it means he has moved from being predictable to being interesting. Again, this is not about games or manipulation. It's about human psychology responding to change. Because certainty creates comfort, but curiosity creates focus. And once focus is activated, emotional engagement often follows in ways that are more intentional and less automatic. At this stage, she is no longer trying to restore what was. She is trying to understand what this new version of you actually means. 6, the respect that can grow when you don't over-pursue. At this stage, the dynamic inside the relationship starts to feel noticeably different, even if nothing has been openly discussed. After curiosity has entered the picture, something deeper can begin to form respect. And I want to be very precise here because I'm not talking about fear, control, or emotional distance used as a strategy. I'm talking about respect that naturally develops when a person realizes they are dealing with someone who is not driven by over-pursuit or emotional overextension. Let me bring in a real relationship example I've seen in my work. A woman in a long-term relationship described her partner as someone who used to be very emotionally available in a way that almost felt like constant pursuit. He would over-explain, over-check, and overextend himself just to maintain connection. Over time, she began to feel the weight of that consistency, not because she disliked him, but because there was no space for emotional breathing room. Then something shifted. He didn't become cold or distant in a harsh way. He simply stopped over-pursuing. He still cared, still communicated, still showed up, but with more balance, more calmness, and less emotional urgency. What changed inside her was not immediate attraction, but perception. She started to see him differently. In our conversations, she described it in a very simple way. He feels more grounded now. And that word grounded is very important psychologically because groundedness communicates emotional stability, not dependence. And emotional stability often creates a quiet form of respect. She began to notice that he was not easily thrown off emotionally. He didn't chase every small shift in her mood. He didn't try to fix every moment of silence. He didn't over-explain himself anymore. Instead, he responded when needed and remained steady when things were uncertain. And this is where respect starts to grow, because when someone stops over-pursuing, they stop overexposing their emotional dependency. And when emotional dependency becomes less visible, the other person begins to recalibrate how they perceive them. She started to recognize that his presence wasn't something she could assume on autopilot anymore. Not because he was playing games, but because he was no longer operating from a place of emotional overinvestment. And in many relationships I've observed, this shift changes the internal hierarchy of perception. Not in a controlling way, but in a grounding way. He is no longer seen as someone who is emotionally chasing stability through her response. Instead, he becomes someone who already carries his own stability. That is where respect quietly forms. She may not verbalize it directly. She may not even analyze it consciously at first, but she feels it in the way she engages with him. There is more thoughtfulness in her responses, more attentiveness in her communication, less assumption that he will always overcompensate for emotional gaps. Because when over-pursuit disappears, so does predictability in emotional availability. And unpredictability, when paired with calm consistency, often leads to a deeper level of regard. In that relationship example, she eventually admitted something important. I started listening to him more when he stopped trying so hard to make me listen. That is the paradox many men don't expect. Sometimes stepping back from over-pursuit doesn't reduce connection. It refines it. Not because distance itself creates value, but because emotional balance changes how presence is interpreted. And in that recalibration, respect is often one of the first shifts that appears. 7, the realization of your emotional value through distance. At this final stage, something shifts that brings the entire psychological process together. After noticing confusion, internal ego reflection, questioning control versus interest, curiosity, and the gradual formation of respect, she arrives at a deeper realization. Not always instantly, not always in a dramatic moment, but slowly through comparison and emotional recalibration. She begins to understand your emotional value more clearly through your absence or reduced pursuit. Let me explain this in a real relationship context I've seen unfold. A woman in a committed relationship once described a phase where her partner became less emotionally available in the way she was used to. He didn't disappear and he didn't act negatively. He simply stopped over-investing emotionally in every interaction. He was still present, still kind, still engaged, but no longer emotionally chasing connection at every moment. At first, she tried to interpret it, then she questioned it. Then she observed it. But over time, something more subtle happened. She started comparing, and comparison is where realization begins. She began to notice how interactions felt different now compared to before. Not necessarily worse or better, but different in emotional weight. Conversations that used to feel automatic now felt more intentional. His presence, which once felt guaranteed, now felt more conscious. And in that shift, she started to understand something she hadn't fully recognized before. His emotional presence had value she had been taking for granted. This is where distance becomes psychologically powerful. Because when emotional access becomes less automatic, the mind starts assigning more significance to it. It is not that your value suddenly increases out of nowhere. It's that the perception of your value becomes clearer when it is no longer constantly available without effort. In this relationship example, she started noticing small internal reactions. She would feel slightly more attentive when he spoke, slightly more reflective when he withdrew. Not because she was losing him, but because she was now aware of what his emotional presence actually contributed to her sense of stability. And here is the key psychological shift. She began to realize that his emotional consistency was not just background noise in the relationship. It was part of the emotional structure she had been leaning on without fully acknowledging it. When that structure became less automatic, its importance became more visible. From my experience observing many similar dynamics, this stage is not about sudden emotional breakthroughs. It is about gradual awareness. She begins to understand that your attention, your effort, and your emotional engagement were not just normal behavior. They were value indicators in the relationship. And once something is seen as valuable after being less available, its significance increases in the mind. But what makes this stage especially important is that it is not driven by pressure. It is driven by realization. She is not being convinced. She is not being chased into understanding. She is arriving at it through experience. She starts to recognize that emotional availability is not something she can assume indefinitely without reflection. And that realization changes how she perceives you moving forward. In some cases, it leads to a deeper appreciation of your presence. In others, it leads to a clearer understanding of what she wants from the dynamic, but in all cases, it is no longer neutral. Because once someone understands your emotional value through absence, they can no longer relate to your presence in the same unconscious way again. And that is the final shift. When distance doesn't just create curiosity or respect, but clarity about what your emotional presence actually means in her psychological world. In conclusion, when a man stops chasing, it doesn't create one simple reaction. It triggers a psychological process. First, she notices the shift. Then confusion replaces expectation. After that, she begins a quiet internal evaluation, questioning both the situation and herself. As the distance continues, curiosity grows, followed by a natural development of respect. When emotional pressure is removed over time, this leads to a clearer realization of your emotional value. What seems like doing less is actually a shift in perception. In relationships, silence doesn't just create space. It reveals meaning, clarity, and emotional truth that constant pursuit often hides.